Dr. Simmons characterizes her work as mostly nomothetic because she is focused on instructional design. She described an interesting study on splitting the difference between standard protocol and individualization to make it more feasible. The researchers used data to identify content that had not been mastered and then did group instruction, but regrouped at different points in time to make homogeneous groups based on specific skill deficits. That study kind of exemplified how she could take a nomothetic approach that was really centered on instructional design and target the individual needs of learners. As I watched the videos and read the content in this module, I found myself agreeing with several researchers who described idiographic and nomothetic approaches as a continuum rather than a dichotomy. And in particular, I found myself really agreeing with researchers who sort of related that continuum to the RTI pyramid. So when I was listening to Dr. Simmons, I found myself thinking quite a bit about tier two. So she described using nomothetic ideas like principles of design or instruction that works for a particular skill, but being purposeful about matching the right learner to the right intervention. And that way of thinking that she described stood out to me as a really promising way to design tier two interventions.
I agree with the comment Brittany made on the previous slide regarding the description of nomothetic and idiographic intervention styles as a pyramid. I believe interventions are a continuum of services that a student receives in the classroom, and that one way to intensify these services is by using a more individualized or idiographic approach. In her video, Dr. Simmons focused a portion of her discussion on looking specifically at the design of the instruction when applying it in specifically a tier 2 nomothetic setting. She made this one really strong comment about feasibility in the classroom, and by increasing feasibility for the teacher by splitting the difference between a standard intervention protocol and individualization. One way she mentioned doing this was, I found interesting, while maintaining small group settings in tier 2 classroom, she created more homogeneous groups among the students after seeing several data points of performance. And having these more homogeneous groups allowed the teacher to individualize the instruction for the students.
As soon as I learned what the words meant in this module, I knew I was in the idiographic camp. But the more that I learned and heard and read about them, the more I came to agree with the general consensus that it's not a dichotomy, as George Sagai put it, but a continuum. But most of us see that continuum as being heavier on the idiographic piece as you continue up that triangle. And most of my work has been at the top of that triangle, so I understand the need to be idiographic there. However, I think we're often idiographic to a fault up there. I think we can do better at investigating and finding patterns in those populations without having to reinvent the wheel for every difficult student. Dr. Simmons talked about making interventions more feasible to improve fidelity, and I think that is the most important with low incidence, because the overall feeling with teachers is my student is so different and has unique needs, I can't just use that intervention as is. So I think, as Dr. Simmons and others talked about, the more we learn about how kids learn, the better we will be at matching those interventions to students and improving those outcomes, and not having to make something specific and new and different for every single kid at the top of that pyramid.
After watching the videos, we had several remaining questions about Dr. Simmons' video. Our first question is about the comment about creating homogeneous small groups to individualize instruction in Tier 2 classrooms. This was really interesting, an interesting approach to intensify interventions. So what characteristics of the student's prior performance or performance on the current intervention are utilized to best create these small groups to increase the effectiveness of the intervention? Our second question is about adapting standard protocol and adapting it and mixing in the element of individualization. How far can a teacher adapt a standard protocol or an instructional practice while maintaining fidelity to the intended intervention? And our third question for Dr. Simmons, in this new area of cognition in education research, she mentioned that cognitive psychology seems to have better measures than we might have in special education research. So how best can we find these measures, and how best can we implement or utilize them in education research? We had one final question, actually about Dr. Swanson's video. He talked a little bit about this idea of control versus comparison groups, and how maybe some of our control groups are actually comparison groups. And a little more elaboration on that would be really helpful, because we thought that was a really interesting and useful perspective.